Hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with by Kangaroo Minds. I am Vedika, and today we have with us James Hatchman. James is the founder and CEO of Voice of Health, a preventative mental health app which provides individuals with a safe space to connect with active trained listeners, to be heard, understood, and empowered. James took to this space after his own experiences of supporting loved ones with their mental health. Additionally, now James has moved into the space of preventative personalized healthcare. Our conversation today is going to be around the topic of understanding and cultivating empathy, particularly in the context of mental health. But before we begin, I would like to put out a trigger warning for our audiences. If at any point during this conversation, should you find yourself feeling triggered or distressed, we urge you to take a step back and look after yourself. Should you need any additional support resources, you can also find them on our website. And now, without taking up much time, let's hear more from James. James, welcome back. It's great to have you for another very enriching conversation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back for the third conversation for us, and I think the topic we're going to be discussing is a perfect it sews in perfectly to the other conversations we've had because I think it's the foundation of a lot of the other parts that we had talked about previously. So it's an absolute pleasure to be back.
No, absolutely. And I think, as you said, just it goes so well with the work that even you're doing. And of course, the fundamental bits of mental health and mental health support, right? Which is active listening and helping provide people with safe spaces.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think yeah, I agree.
So let's dive in with the most it's a basic question. It's something everybody kind of thinks about. We talk about it, but very often we don't know how to explain it. So
Mm.
coming to empathy, how would you define empathy, especially in a mental health context?
Yeah, I mean, the overarching one is always your capacity to connect with the emotions that others are experiencing or the experiences that they're having or the perspectives that they have as well. I think the perspectives part is the one that I think a lot of people miss out on thinking about because empathy is your capacity to be able to both feel what they're going through, but also see what they're going through their eyes in that sense. And in a mental health perspective, I think that it's the foundation for any good interaction that is, going to lead to potentially a positive outcome or where a person feels heard, understood, and empowered as such. And so I think it's the I often use the line, and I can't remember where I put it, but I'm sure it's somewhere on our website as well, which is like it all begins with empathy because that's kind of the opening piece to any good safe space, any good active listening interaction, or any good relationship you're going to have with someone else.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to this whole, the whole safe space and active listening bit. But just moving from there, how would you say that empathy is sort of different from sympathy or pity or even compassion? Because a lot of times, we use the words very
Mm.
interchangeably.
Yeah, I think I always forget the exact quote, but I think it's the line of sympathy is feeling for someone, empathy is feeling with someone. And so I think that you're sharing in the emotions that someone is experiencing when you're empathizing with them and when you're sympathizing with them, is that you're not necessarily stepping over the line and experiencing it with them or understanding it. I think sympathy is like, yeah, like I said, you're feeling for them, but I don't know if you're necessarily going that one layer deeper. And I think compassion is another one. Compassion, I don't think is necessarily void of empathy all the time. I don't think that means. I think you can be compassionate because you are empathizing with them. Um, and I think pity is an interesting one. I haven't explored pity too much in my mind, but it's pity. I think sometimes it has a level of comparison involved in it, and so it's you pity that person because your situation may be better, and so you go, "Oh, that must be tough." And so are you necessarily connecting with how they're feeling? Who knows? Because sometimes it might be a perspective. It might be that we look at some person's situation, we go, "I pity them" or "I sympathize with them," but actually they're happy and they love their situation. It's, there's a lot of people moving to this more like a good example is like a more basic life, they don't have all the riches and all the things and they want to just live a really grounded basic life. And you might go, I sympathize with them, they don't have much, but actually they go, well, actually I love this because I don't have much and I'm happy. And so we pity and sympathize, but had we empathized, we would have had a much better understanding of that person as opposed to, just kind of from our side in, as opposed to being in that side, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's that's really interesting, just sort of distinguishing between the terms and sort of realizing where people are coming from. And it's almost like I know we use the phrase, being in someone's shoes a lot, especially in an empathy concept, but it's more about also understanding that even if you can't be in their shoes, because sometimes we may not be able to exactly relate to a person, but at least it's about trying to feel what they're experiencing, trying to kind of put
Mm.
yourself out there. And if we don't understand, just at least being able to hold space for a range
Yeah.
of varied experiences, right?
I think that's a good point, which is that, yeah, you don't have to be fully walking in their shoes or fully understanding everything about them to be empathizing with them. You can be trying, and even just a little bit is still you showing empathy. And I think that's an important point, which is like you haven't necessarily failed to empathize with someone just because you didn't have a full understanding. You can still be doing that on a journey to better understand them. I think that's a good point to mention.
How do you feel that you've been in that space of supporting loved ones, and of course, the work that you do with VOH is also about helping people who might be struggling. And when we come down to talking about empathy at sort of the core of those interactions, what role do you feel that empathy plays, especially in mental health related interactions or in helping people with their recovery?
Yeah, I think empathy is the starting point to remove judgment from those conversations, because I think that, like, when you begin to judge, you begin to step into, oh, I need to provide advice, I need to fix this person, and you go like, if you don't empathize, you may be focusing on their behavior or what the words they say. But if you lace empathy into it, then you're probably going to be addressing the thing that sits behind that. So if they're getting a little bit passive aggressive or they're unhappy or whatever their reactions are, you go, okay, that's not a reflection of me providing the support or me being here for that person. It's actually a reflection of what sits behind that. And so I'll use empathy to get past that wall and understand them on a deeper level. And so it means that your interactions are already connecting at a deeper level rather than just that, I guess, surface layer. And so I think it's essential, because we do talk about safe spaces being non-judgmental spaces. And so I would say that, yeah, that empathy is your number one tool to remove that judgment, because it's hard to judge when you understand the deeper reasons behind why someone was behaving or saying something. Um, and yeah, and then naturally, that also ties into to active listening, because it's one of the four pillars of active listening is empathy.
Yeah, I was just going to come to that, that if you want to talk a little bit more about how empathy sort of aids active listening and helps build safe spaces, in the sense that, when you say that it is the fourth pillar, like, what exactly is that role empathy plays?
Yeah, I I think foundationally, it's like it's the thing that you can fall back on in any situation. So it's like, if you're not sure how to move forward in a situation, use it as your number one tool to take the next step forward. Because even if it's not, obviously apparent which way that you want to take that space or take that conversation, um, I think that if your empathy provide is that is that's why I use the word foundational, in that it should be the root of all of the other parts of what you're going to do. And so I think, especially with, from a practical perspective with an active listening situation, it's, everything that you hear from that person, but and everything that you see from that person, whether it's body language or it's voice or it's, tone, it's all of these ways that they might be talking. You can empathize with every little small part of it and then paint a picture of that person. And so, yeah, you'll be able to have a better understanding of them, better understanding of their perspectives. And yeah, I think you'll just find that I mean, I always tell people, just lace a little bit more empathy into your conversations and see how it transforms your relationships with everyone, not just the people you're supporting. And it'll make a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, like besides in a mental health context, I think empathy also has a big role to play in our interpersonal relationships with people. Whether or
Mm.
not we're looking at it from a mental health lens or a mental health support lens, but just sort of in helping just making us more present in a conversation, just
Mhm.
making sure that, we understand people, that we can hold space for what they're talking about. And as you said, kind of keep the judgment
I
aside.
was just going to say, so I was just going to say that, yeah, I think that's a good point, is that we do often talk about empathy and active listening and safe spaces in the mental health space. And I think that's obviously where it starts and where we've kind of where we want it to be, definitely. But I've done workshops and delivered workshops to corporates, and they go, God, I wish we had a bit more empathy around here, and in our day-to-day interactions and business meetings, and it's like, and people go, oh, isn't that, you'd think that would be all reserved for the mental health space, and it's like, no, literally every interaction you have, it could be the person you go and get coffee from every morning, it could be the person you interact with at work all day, it could be a loved one, it could be someone you're supporting in mental health, or whatever it is. If you lace these things into these principles into those interactions, I think you'll find every single one of them will probably go better.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and that empathy is not just something that, we need to reserve as people in the mental health space, but also for
Mm.
everyone else around us, irrespective of what the nature of those conversations are. But I don't know if you've seen a recent data point, which I happened to stumble over, which was that the current younger generation is 40% less empathetic than the previous generation.
So did you say 40% less empathetic? Wow. That's a
And
big
these are
number.
like sort of self-reporting information, right?
Mm,
Like that they feel that they're not able to be empathetic, they're not able to empathize with people. So,
mm.
and given that we've
Interesting.
spoken about the importance of empathy, do you feel that, empathy could be cultivated as a skill? Could it be learned, or does it have to be something that, you have within you innately and that's about it?
Yeah, it's just a couple of parts to that. I think that definitely empathy can be taught. I mean, even people that I've worked with through VO, by working within our organization or, talking about it over time have become more empathetic and have been able to embrace it a bit more. I think you do often want to make sure that the person has some level of emotional literacy and understanding, because I think it is kind of the final step in terms of your understanding, like when you really do step into empathy. But it's certainly something that can be cultivated at a young age, whether it's through the parents, through children's books and things like that, as well. And I think just displaying it as a parent, to your kids and show and being and actually taking the time to understand their feelings could, it's a bit like the quote I use for listening, which is around, great listeners are not born; they're inspired by those who listen to them. And it's the same thing. Great empathizers aren't born; they're inspired by those who empathize with them. And so, if you can do that for young people, I think they will have a better understanding of how to do that. And as they grow up, that will probably mean that they're more likely to really harness the power of empathy as well. But yeah, I think also there's a part of it that is like you've got to do a bit of the better you can empathize with your own self and understand your own feelings, like going, oh, why did I behave like that? Why did I say like that? What was the deeper reason? You can practice empathy with yourself and never have a conversation with anyone, and then be a better empathizer externally. It's like you're doing a bit of self-reflection, and that helps you empathize with your own situation because you'll understand your situation better than anyone else. So it's a good practice.
That's interesting. And I know you briefly touched upon, how parents can build empathy skills in children. But when we talk about ourselves sort of as adults, do you think that there are any strategies or practices that people can do to just build upon their own skills of empathy?
Yeah, I mean, it's often a lot of reflection. I often would say, like, if you have an interaction where you didn't think it went the way you wanted, or you felt like you reacted, or you noticed that judgment was the first thing that came up in the situation, maybe just think about how you could adjust that in the future. It's you're never going to get it perfect. I mean, like I said, I spout all about empathy all the time, and I'm not always perfect at it. We never are. It might be that my state of mind is that I'm not feeling particularly empathetic in that moment. But the more you practice it, the more it is likely to become your default. And if you can get to that point, through I would say self-reflection is the number one, but also just maybe try the empathy thing with people who will, support you and love you no matter what the situation, even if it's not perfect, and then just see how it transforms. Because I know a lot of people who, even the interactions they have with family members, could be drastically improved if they provided a little bit more empathy in their situation. But those people are going to love you unconditionally. So it's a good place to really practice it and see how it transforms and go from there. And then once again, yeah, the way that you empathize with yourself, you can eventually make that an outward facing process as well to others. Yeah, I think that would be the kind of where I would kind of focus my attention.
I think that's quite a deep point to think about that, where do we start with practicing empathy and, how do we take feedback on when we're sort of learning through that process? And I think one of the things that I would also add for anybody who hasn't heard or listened to our previous conversations where we've spoken about things like, active listening and safe spaces that, empathy could be cultivated even in those kind of spaces. So whether you do
Mm,
the book training or, whether you're part of a listening space, I think, just sort of learning from others and seeing from others and sort of role modeling that behavior, like, you mentioned, could
mm.
go a long way.
Definitely. Yeah, understanding the perspectives of other people or even just hearing the perspectives of other people gives you essentially potentially multiple angles to look at one situation. And so then now you're learning the capacity to be able to see different perspectives, and that it helps with empathy a lot. So yeah, surrounding yourself with those type of situations is also positive for sure.
So have you seen that, for example, we know that sometimes people do face barriers when it comes to, being able to actively listen or support someone. But even when it comes to empathy, do you feel that there are some challenges or barriers that people might experience when, when it comes to expressing empathy?
Yeah, it's going to sound like a really weird one to talk about because I was thinking about this the other day, which was just like the brutal point of it's hard to empathize when you just don't care. You know what I mean? So I know that sounds super brutal, but like there are just going to be situations where really it actually you don't care, or actually you shouldn't necessarily be diving too deep into empathy because it might have a negative effect on you, and you might experience, if you're naturally empathetic, it might take its toll. So there are some of those situations. Um, but as far as barriers, I think it is just having the capacity to be patient and resilient and know that you're not going to get it right every time. And that barrier is that you've just got to kind of keep working at it. You're not expected. There are people who are naturally more empathetic than others. Some people are just it's just how we're wired or how we were kind of brought up as well. If we didn't come from a naturally empathetic household, then learning at a later stage is going to be a much bigger barrier for someone who maybe experienced it earlier. So I think that would be one part of it. I think even just yeah, the emotional literacy. So just the barrier of not necessarily knowing even some of the more basic stuff in this space makes it harder to grasp the full breadth of empathy. You can kind of understand the definition of it, walk in someone's shoes or, understand how they're feeling. But I think embodying empathy is something you have to work hard at.
I think that's pretty true, that also another thing that people sometimes do end up struggling with is like, your own frame of reference. And we
Mm.
talked about this previously in another conversation that, how hard it is to sort of place, your judgment, your worldview aside and sort of see things from another person's perspective. But also, sometimes do you feel that, cultural factors, social background comes in the way of us being able to empathize with others?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, it becomes a barrier. But I think one thing we've learned with Voice of Health is that the often the most common definition of who you would consider a peer is not actually usually the case, because like I've had, like the intersectionality of who can empathize with who is pretty astounding sometimes, because you go, oh, how could this person's experience of life possibly be the right person to actually support this person because they're so culturally different, socially different, all sorts of things. But actually, when you stripped it all back and you just went at a human level and it came to empathy, it was like actually there's a huge amount of parallels between these two people. So I think I think by stripping it back to empathy, you actually help to overcome a lot of those barriers. Um, but I think that it can be tough because I mean, when it comes to, I mean, culture especially is a really tough one because, culture is not just a snapshot in that moment or how what they're experiencing. It could be decades worth of a lived experience within a particular culture that has shaped them that someone else is just never going to fully understand. And so, there are certain barriers that I think we overcome with, okay, if I want to talk about my particular experience, I might have to seek someone who's had a very similar cultural experience. And so that might be a barrier to be able to get a better level of empathy for my situation. But then at the same time, I've seen super powerful empathy and supportive moments experienced between two people from extremely different cultures, but just realizing that like they actually weren't that different in the end, and that like the extremes of each situation actually helped each other relate in a better way. So it happens. It happens both ways. But yeah, they can definitely be a capacity, a barrier for empathy. I mean, the disability space is an interesting one as well. When it comes to the barriers, I think it's once again, it's maybe you don't have a full capacity to empathize with someone's lived experience if you haven't experienced that same disability yourself. But I think that it goes back to a point we've discussed before, which is as long as you're trying, you're still empathizing. It may not be perfect and it may not be 100%, and you'll achieve 100% sometimes. But if you give 80% empathy in your interaction because there's a 20% of that person you can't empathize with because you just haven't had that experience, I think you're still doing the right thing. I think I would never beat someone up, I would no, sorry, I'd never let someone beat themselves up for not doing a good job if they hadn't achieved perfect empathy because there were these barriers in the way. You've still done the right thing.
No, I think that's really interesting, right? Because when we talk about things like, I mean, some empathy is better than not showing any empathy at all, or at least like, sometimes we don't know who needs a conversation. But also coming back to the whole cultural reference that we spoke about, you're right. Like sometimes there are individuals from cultures, especially interestingly South Asian cultures, right, where there's so much intergenerational trauma. So whether it's people who live
Mm,
in the subcontinent, where their families have been through partition or war, and even
mm,
now with the way the situation is in a lot of parts of the world, right, with war and conflict, just sort of being
mm.
able to relate, we may feel that we can't, but as you said, if you can take it down to the bare minimum sort of human experience, there is empathy at the bottom of it.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that's perfectly summed up. Yeah.
And you spoke about briefly the negative impacts of empathy. And sometimes, when we do hear these stories, right, about things like compassion fatigue or empathy burnout, or whether it's sort of a vicarious trauma coming from, just showing a lot of empathy to people. So how do you think, we can sort of maintain empathetic engagements, but while also preventing that sort of burnout and backlash on ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic ones are boundaries, self-care, and as part of self-care, a lot of self-reflection, because I think that like we can very easily put ourselves into a mindset where we're going, no, no, I'm just helping. They need my help. They need to, but it's like, yeah, but you need your help as well. You need to make sure that you're not doing it. And if you're a natural people pleaser, or you're naturally empathetic and you can feel the person's situation, yeah, it's very easy to continue to get even more ingrained in that. And I think you got to healthy boundaries, I would say. And yeah, just take moments to identify if that is actually, is there a chance that this is affecting you too much? Look out for some of the signs that you might be experiencing some of these things like vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. Because I mean, sometimes they're super obvious. Vicarious trauma, especially, can just hit you out of nowhere, and you're like, oh wow, that I did until something adverse happened to the person I was supporting. I didn't even realize how intertwined I was into this situation. So it can actually hit you like a ton of bricks. But for compassion fatigue is an interesting one because I think that's the one that creeps up on you, and then you suddenly are like, a few months past where you probably should have scaled things back a little bit, and you're wondering why you're not you're getting sick more, or you're feeling really tired more, like, and it starts to almost manifest itself in your own physical well-being as well. Then you're starting to, and maybe some of your other relationships are being jeopardized as a result of this compassion fatigue. So I think that you got to look out for those signs, set boundaries, and know that it's okay, and that you'll actually be able to support people better if you do focus on setting those boundaries and checking in with yourself. You'll do a better job. Supporting everyone at a low frequency is not going to help anyone's situation. You want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself in that situation.
No, I think, as you said, like the self-care piece plays such a huge role, whether we're looking out for ourselves or whether we're supporting others. And I guess, that's what they say, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. So I think it's so important to check in with how you're feeling. How is this impacting you? Because you don't want to be mid, helping someone, whether it's in a crisis intervention role or something, you find yourself in a space of like empathy burnout. Because I
Mm,
think for people who are very deeply rooted in that space of empathy and, wanting to support others, it can lead to a lot of guilt as well.
mm, definitely, definitely.
But, when we come back to the fundamental things around supporting people, whether it's as a mental health professional, whether it's as a friend, whether it's as an, active listener within, the VO
Mm.
environment or any of those mental health spaces, how do you feel that sort of empathy helps towards, whether it's building trust, helping create that rapport, and sort of building or facilitating safe environments for people?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the trust thing is an absolutely important part. And I think we've talked about it before, is it's the other one of the pillars of good active listening. I think empathy helps with trust because when you are coming from a place of empathy, you're probably going to be crafting more thoughtful questions for the person, and you're going to be really engaging, and you're going to make that person feel heard. And because you're like, oh wow, they didn't just hear what I said, they almost felt what I said in a way. And so you're going to have much better interactions in those environments if you can empathize, because it will facilitate trust. It will facilitate your capacity to be able to listen better, because and ultimately, by listening better, you're going to make that person feel listened to and feel heard. And so you're probably going to inspire them to feel like they can open up a bit more because you've empathized instead of judged. And so now they go, well, actually, I'm happy to share. It's funny because, like, I even had this joke with my mum sometimes, which is like, I feel like because I often lead every conversation with empathy, she always says it's like you have a giant neon sign on your head that says share everything with me, because I just don't judge. Um, and so people just open up, and she's like, you end up with people's entire life story with like three questions. And I'm like, I don't know how it happens, but I just don't judge anyone in those situations. I mean, it is your experience. So it definitely facilitates a more open and safe conversation, because that person's, the last thing you want is someone to have fear for sharing something vulnerable. That should be it's because you know I think we've talked about it before with the vulnerability. We often talk about vulnerability being a very heavy subject, but actually there's a lightness to it if they can feel like they can just share it with no judgment. They're like, wow, that was so refreshing to be able to be that vulnerable and that open with someone. And it's because they empathize with me and they just didn't judge, and they just stayed there and tried to understand. So yeah, I think it's a powerful tool for all those situations.
No, I think you're right. I think, being empathetic with people who might be struggling can help remove that whole, what's now called as the vulnerability hangover. And I think we spoke about it in one of our previous conversations where,
Mm,
oftentimes after someone has shared how they feel, you don't want them to go back feeling that, have I, should I not have had that conversation? Have
mm,
I kind of overshared? What if, what is the other person going to think of me? Or have I felt judged in that situation? Or, sort of
mm,
having a regret. And I think just being empathetic and letting people know that you're listening,
mm,
and sort of
mm,
the whole active listening piece, right? Where you're listening not just with your ears, but also with your eyes, and you're absorbing things, you're feeling it with your heart, you're kind of experiencing what the other person
mm,
is saying, their tone. I think that can really shift conversations and not just the quantity of conversation, also the quality of the conversation that you're going to have with someone.
Mm. Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it drastically increases the quality because I think that's yeah, there's a lot of talking that gets done that's maybe not necessarily as productive as it could be. But the vulnerability hangover is an interesting one. I mean, there's a whole podcast in supporting people post sharing almost, I reckon, and how that kind of process works because it's a big part of it. I mean, it I guess it reiterates that whole mind body kind of connection because it can actually physically manifest itself when you feel like you've been super vulnerable and you're like, okay, now what, how should I be feeling, what should I be feeling, how would I as a person want to support someone who had just been vulnerable. So yeah, it's interesting.
No, definitely is. And you sort of, as we said, I think empathy allows us to have more, deeper conversations, more non-judgmental conversations, and also just have safer spaces where people do feel that, yes, I can share and yes, I'm not going to be judged. And, whether or not the other person completely comes from the same frame of reference as me, at least they're going to try and understand what I'm talking about and sort of
Mm.
keep it away from toxic positivity, right? Like that's also a huge, huge thing now that how do you sort of steer clear from toxic positivity when you're supporting someone?
Yeah, the toxic positivity one is a really interesting one because I think I've experienced a few different parts of it, which is like because I would say that most toxic positivity it all comes from the right place,
Mm.
but it might be fundamentally in a lot of cases it's fundamentally missing the point or not actually getting through, and it's like sometimes things are negative. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it's a bad situation, so acknowledging that as well is okay. And I think that people go from encouraging to toxic positivity quite quickly if they overdo it. But I've also experienced another situation, which I don't know if it necessarily falls into the same category, but it's moments where you're positive and you're optimistic about that person's situation because you've empathized with them and you've done what you need to do. And you might say something, but because of whatever they've been through, trauma, whatever it is, life experience, it doesn't hit home because they don't even believe you when you say it because they haven't even felt it themselves or seen it themselves yet, but you've seen it and you're like, oh, this is an optimistic path forward, and you're like, this is great and let's talk about it, and that's positive. And then they don't see it. So it's like you almost accidentally ended up in toxic positivity, even though you did empathize. So it's because they didn't have an understanding of it, as opposed to the version where it's just you're always positive and overly positive, and it's toxic in that sense because it's not really acknowledging the person. It's just optimism thrown in their face. But then there's the other one where you did nail it and they just weren't ready for it. Um, so yeah, it's a fascinating space, and it only I mean it's only when you start to reflect on how these conversations have gone that you start to kind of see the little nuances in how it can all unfold.
And I think I'm not sure if many people have thought of that perspective that, where you're trying to empathize with someone and
Mm,
you can sort of probably see a bigger picture, or maybe you can see hope for them and they can't see it themselves. And in
mm.
those situations, how do you sort of communicate with the other person and tell them that it's not that you're judging them, it's not that you're making light of their issues, but, just to be able to communicate hope?
Yeah, that's a real tough one. I would say it becomes easier I think the longer or the better the relationship you have with that person in that sense. Um, because yeah, I think that's a good point you mentioned, which is like in an initial interaction, it might seem like you're making light of the situation because you're just going, well, this seems like the right thing to do. I don't have a full understanding. But if you've known someone for a long time, then there's maybe more of a chance that person is going to realize that you have a deep understanding of them, and that actually, they maybe some of the words actually do sink in. Um, yeah, and I mean, that also then opens the box of the conversation around, but are the people that we've had the longest relationships the ones that make the most assumptions about us as well? Whole nother conversation again in that as well. So Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, there's so many elements to that.
I think, now if we come back to the whole mental health and sort of mental illness piece,
Mm.
as you said, sometimes even for mental health professionals to communicate to people who might be struggling that, because from their perspective, of course, they see recovery, they see that people could, recover, they know that there are chances of things getting better, but individuals don't always feel it. And especially when individuals find themselves stuck in harder situations. There are a lot of times when mental health professionals can end up getting really frustrated and sort of, they can come
Mm.
off as very unempathetic and almost
Yeah,
very harsh onto someone.
totally. It's the like, why don't you get it complex.
Yeah, it is. It is. There's a lot of
Mm.
transference happening. There's a lot of counter
Mm.
transference happening. Because there are times when mental health professionals might tell someone that, you're not doing me any good. And I'm like, that's not how a mental health conversation needs to go.
Mm.
But so, how do you think mental health professionals as well can sort of keep that empathy in check when dealing with people?
Oof. I think that I think patience is a big part of it. I think you have to match the timeline of the individual, and not expect them to move at your pace. And I think that that's to tie it back into the topic of the conversation is that if you really have empathized with that person, then you'll understand where they're at in their journey when it comes to understanding what they're going through themselves. If you've empathized with someone who is very aware of these things, then okay, maybe their timeline is quicker and they're going to get these things quicker and it's going to settle in quicker and you can move at a pace that you want. But, some people are just not going to be able to be at that pace. And so I think if you were a mental health worker providing support in that situation, is that you just have to remember that you might be someone that is constantly surrounded by these conversations, have a deep understanding, you've done training, you've done, a lot of work on yourself, you've read books, you've got all of this knowledge, and then you're just expecting that all the time you spent doing that is immediately implemented into this person's brain that they're going to be able to keep up. It's you have to be patient in that sense. And I think that like it's yeah, when people get frustrated in those situations, I think it also leads to more situations where they're feeling like they need to just give advice to just problem solve. Um, and so, there might be situations where guidance is helpful, but like if you just find that you're getting frustrated, just focus on listening. Just sit there and listen and take it in and just let that person, process things. Maybe even, at the end of every time they speak, just give them an extra 10 seconds worth of space to talk and see if they get there themselves. Because you're getting frustrated going, I'll just give them the answer here. It's just like, just give them a sec. Maybe they're you shutting up. They're one moment of you shutting up away from actually discovering it themselves. But because you're so frustrated, you've moved them forward quicker than they were ready. And then they didn't learn the lesson because they didn't get a chance to dive deeper. So patience is what I would say is the number one tool in that situation. But it takes a lot. It takes a lot. I say the word patience, but that's a skill in itself that you've got to learn over time. It really does.
No, I think you're really right, that you do need a lot of patience when it comes to displaying empathy, especially in mental health settings, or whether it's crisis intervention, or whether it's even suicide prevention for that matter, right?
Mm,
Because a lot of times people are not in a space where they can articulate themselves. They may not be in a place where they're
mm,
able to even absorb the sort of advice that you're attempted to give them, or even the place that you're coming from. So I think just
mm.
holding that space
Yeah.
and sort of letting them know that they can take their time to sort of, get
Mm,
there, and without sort of rushing them, without sort of guilt tripping them, without telling them that, they're falling behind.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing is, I think a lot of the like low level frustration comes from a good place because they're like, I want to move you forward and help you, and that's good. But then maybe the combination of that with compassion fatigue and stuff is going to then lead to frustration. It's going to lead to negative things like, I mean, guilt tripping is terrible. You should never do that. It's like weaponizing someone's guilt, and it's terrible, terrible, terrible thing to do. So yeah, if you find yourself getting to that point, yeah, maybe it's time to just take a bit of self-care and step away from it for a second. and focus on yourself for a moment.
And I think also, based on whatever we spoke, a lot of empathy, I think, is also about meeting people where they are.
Mm,
Because, as you said, just because you've read so much and you've learned so much and you've trained so much, it's not necessary that everything's going to, transpire into that person in one conversation. So if we want to
mm.
empathize with them, it's sort of about us coming to where they are, than rather just expecting them to make a jump to, where we are in that point when having these conversations.
Totally, completely agree. Meeting them where they're at is, yeah, just a perfect way to put it.
And I think we spoke about patience, but I think the other thing we don't talk about enough in terms of empathy is also the resilience that you need to display empathy, to also make sure that, when we talk about things like having boundaries and looking after ourselves, sort of that role of resilience, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to have the resilience to be able to set boundaries and also to look after yourself and to be able, because you are essentially taking, you might, and in a lot of cases when you're supporting someone, it's not that you're necessarily taking on the positive emotions, you're often taking on the negative emotions. So you have to have the resilience to basically be able to process that and not let it like negatively affect yourself in that sense. And it will seep through occasionally. And so yeah, so I would say that's a big part of empathy because yeah, I think you have to combine those two, the resilience and the patience together to be able to do a good job of it because yeah, it can really become all encompassing. And if you don't have that resilience to be able to put up that, I don't want to say put up a wall, that's the wrong word for it, but just put up a filter almost for what you can absorb and take in, and then what you need to potentially filter out as part of it. And then reflecting on those moments, I think is good because you know, you might be suddenly going, well, why am I feeling this way in particular? And it's like, well, actually, you need to go back and just reflect on it and realize that maybe you didn't have the resilience you thought you did to be able to handle that situation. But then actually, ironically, by reflecting on it, you probably have built a level of resilience as part of that anyway, because you've become more aware of who you are as in yourself to know that this type of thing would negatively affect you in the future. So you'll have a better capacity to be able to handle it moving forward. So yeah, no, resilience is a big part of it.
Now, I think, we've spoken about lots of aspects about empathy and sort of mental health, and, whether it comes to recovery, whether it's about being a mental health professional, whether it's about, looking after our own mental health and well-being in the process of supporting others. But just to kind of start bringing, the whole conversation, because we started about mental health, we're approaching mental health today. How do you feel that, empathy can play a role when it comes to like reducing stigma that exists, whether it's about mental illness, whether
Mm.
it's about mental health, whether it's about things like suicide prevention? And of course, we touched upon toxic positivity, so we did cover
Mm.
that bit, but just in general, when we talk about mental health and mental illness.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stigma is essentially a community-wide descriptive word of judgment, right? So I think when it comes to removing stigma, the empathy side of things is essentially just going, well, how about as a collective, we try and remove judgment about these situations and try to better understand them and hear them out in these situations. So when you're trying to reduce, you'll always judge or feel like there's a stigma when it comes to mental illness if you continue to not understand it. Because if you truly understood it and you empathized with it, well, then you wouldn't be judging it. So empathy reduces stigma because it reduces judgment. And if you can, try and create, and that's where like, people start talking about systemic empathy and stuff like that. It's like, well, we want to try and create that because that's essentially what stigma is. Judgment is on an individual level. Stigma seems to be on a, or often referred to in a kind of community based. There's a stigma around mental health, mental illness, or stigma around mental health. And so, if you can try and lace empathy into that, you'll often lift that stigma off and kind of uncover what sits below it. And then you can start interacting properly with those who have it. And and then suddenly see that like someone who's going through a mental illness is probably very much like you, but just maybe didn't have a couple of the self-management tools that they needed in order to be able to handle it themselves. And so you're just going to empathize with them and potentially teach them some of the skills you have. So it's just a natural flow on once you lift that veil of stigma with empathy.
Yeah, I think that's you've put it really well, that sort of stigma is more on the collective level. It sort
Mm,
of takes judgment to a whole other level. It's almost like, what individuals believe at a personal level, just taken in a huge, in a
mm,
bigger collective space. And I think in that sense, empathy can also play a huge role around, whether it's emotional literacy, whether it's mental health literacy, whether it's about
mm,
promoting positive mental health as well. So, no, I'm glad we had
mm.
this conversation as well to kind of follow up on everything else that we've spoken about. But just to wrap up this discussion, James, I'm just going to ask you that if you could leave any parting words with somebody who is listening, to this, if they're having a hard time with their mental health, or if they know someone who's having a hard time with their mental health, what would that be?
Oh God, I probably should have prepared something for that, shouldn't I? God, I don't want to. I like it's funny because if you'd asked me this in any other I mean, whether it's in this context or in any other context, when it comes to, I mean, it just so happens that we're talking about empathy today. I would have probably said empathy either way. I would have said, try and try and inject as much empathy into every interaction that you have, and see how it affects you, and see how it changes your relationships, see how it makes you feel, reflect on that, and then choose the course forward from there. Um, yeah, I think that would be it. And it's I think it's this. But if you asked me this for the listening one, I probably said a similar quote, and I think we were talking about this before, which is that uh, similar to the great listeners are not born; they're inspired by those who listen to them. If you are hoping that others in your life will empathize with you better, well, follow the same rule, which is that great empathizers are not born; they're inspired by those who empathize with them. And so, if you can start to spread empathy into your interactions with others, you'll probably find that you're going to receive it more back the other way as well.
No, I think thank you for that. And thank you for taking out time for, another very informative and very educative session. It's always great to have you and great to have these conversations together. So thank you for
That's it.
sharing your experiences and your advice with everyone who's watching and listening. And as I said, if anybody's, having a hard time with their mental health, or if you're supporting someone, please know that it's equally important to look after yourself and know that there's always hope and there's always help and things get better. So until next time,
Yeah.
please stay well and stay healthy. Thank you.